So what if I told you the way you're pruning your pepper plants right now could actually be hurting them? I discovered a simple error I was making that completely changed my perspective on pepper care. Stick around to uncover this common gardening secret and honestly transform your future harvests. Alright, confession time. I thought I knew everything about pruning peppers, and then I made a monumental mistake. My plants looked awful, but what I learned from it was a game changer. If you've ever felt frustrated with your pepper yield, you absolutely need to see the lessons I'm sharing today. Picture this. I'm standing in my garden on a beautiful spring morning, pruning shears in hand, feeling confident about my pepper plants. So, they were getting bushy, maybe a little too tall for my liking, and I thought I had the perfect solution. I'll just give them a good haircut, I told myself. This will make them bushier and more productive, right? Oh man. Wrong. So incredibly wrong. I proceeded to cut back my pepper plants by nearly half their height, removing what I thought were unnecessary branches and leaves. My logic seemed sound at the time, after all. Doesn't pruning encourage new growth in most plants? I had visions of compact, bushy pepper plants loaded with fruit dancing in my head. What I ended up with was a gardening nightmare that taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my growing career. The comparison between my butchered plants and my neighbor's thriving pepper garden next door was, well, honestly, pretty stark and embarrassing. Where her plants stood tall and proud with lush green foliage, mine looked like they'd been attacked by an overzealous landscaper. The difference was so dramatic that even casual observers could spot the problem from across the yard. Oh, the weeks following my aggressive pruning session were, well, filled with mounting anxiety and regret. Instead of the vigorous new growth I expected, my pepper plants seemed to, go into shock. The remaining leaves looked stressed and pale, and honestly, new growth was painfully slow to appear. While my neighbor's plants were already setting their first flowers, mine were still struggling to recover from my well-intentioned assault. What I didn't understand at the time was the critical role that leaves play in a pepper plant's ability to photosynthesize and produce energy. By removing so much foliage, I had severely limited the plant's capacity to feed itself and support healthy growth. You see, pepper plants, unlike some other veggies out there, really rely heavily on their leaf surface area. They capture sunlight and convert it into the energy needed for fruit production. It's pretty fascinating when you think about how important those leaves are for the plant's overall success. Now, the physiological stress I'd imposed on my plants, well, it created a cascade of problems. It's kind of like a domino effect where one issue just leads to another, and before you know it, the plants are struggling. Not only were my plants unable to produce adequate energy for growth, but they also became more susceptible to environmental stresses. Things like temperature fluctuations and pest pressure started to take their toll. It's amazing how these factors can really impact plant health. What should have been my most productive growing season was, turning into a disappointing lesson in plant biology. As summer progressed, the gap between my plants and properly managed ones became honestly increasingly obvious. While healthy pepper plants in other gardens were loaded with developing fruits, mine were still, just trying to rebuild their leaf canopy. So, the few peppers that did manage to form were small, slow to mature, and honestly far fewer in number than what I should have expected. The turning point came when I, swallowed my pride and started researching proper pepper pruning techniques. What I discovered completely transformed my understanding of how these plants should be managed. Unlike tomatoes, which benefit from aggressive sucker removal and pruning, pepper plants have a fundamentally different growth habit that requires a much more conservative approach. The revelation hit me like a ton of garden soil. Pepper plants naturally develop a strong, bushy structure on their own when given the chance. The excessive growth I had been so eager to control was actually exactly what the plants needed to support heavy fruit production. Those branches I had removed weren't stealing energy from fruit development, they were the factory floor where that energy was being produced. Proper pepper pruning, I learned, should be limited to removing diseased, damaged, or dead foliage, along with any branches that are rubbing against each other or growing in awkward directions. The goal isn't to dramatically reshape the plant, but rather to support its natural growth pattern while maintaining good air circulation and plant health. The timing of pruning also proved crucial. Early in the season, when plants are establishing themselves, even minimal pruning can set back development significantly. The best time for any necessary pruning is when plants are well established and actively growing, and even then the approach should be surgical rather than wholesale. Surprisingly, my pruning disaster turned out to be one of the most educational experiences of my gardening journey. While my pepper harvest that year was disappointing, the knowledge I gained was invaluable. Those struggling plants, despite their reduced yield, did eventually recover enough to produce a small but respectable crop of peppers, demonstrating the remarkable resilience of these plants. This experience fundamentally changed how I approach all aspects of gardening. Instead of rushing to intervene whenever I thought plants needed help, I learned to observe more carefully and understand each plant's natural growth patterns before making any decisions. The mistake taught me that sometimes, honestly, the best gardening action is no action at all. My pepper pruning regret turned into one of my most valuable gardening lessons, and I really hope sharing this experience saves you from making the same mistake. Remember, the best gardens are built on a foundation of learning from both successes and failures. Okay, so based on my hard-learned lessons, here's what you need to know to avoid my mistakes and make sure your pepper plants really reach their full potential. The fundamental principle is actually pretty simple. Less is more when it comes to pepper pruning. These plants have evolved to develop an optimal structure for fruit production, and honestly, our job is to support that natural tendency rather than fight against it. If this guide helped you understand pepper pruning better, please subscribe to our Smart Garden channel for more practical gardening wisdom. And, don't forget to share this video with fellow gardeners who might benefit from learning about my pruning adventures. Have you made similar gardening mistakes that turned into valuable lessons? Share your experiences in the comments below. We can all learn from each other's garden journeys.